There are similarities between the US and Turkey in the sense that in both we see an ongoing polarization, but of course at the same time there are enormous differences when I look at the two countries. What is interesting for me is to observe how easily societies can get divided because of politics. Day-to-day angry politics makes people forget what they have in common, and they have so much in common. Maybe it takes an outside observer to realize what they have in common, but they can easily forget these things because politics is so divisive. So we see that pattern in both countries, but of course it makes a huge difference whether a country has a true democracy, has a rule of law, separation of powers, a free and diverse media, at least relatively speaking. So in that regard, I think the situation in Turkey, of course, is much worse. And Turkey is a very interesting country and incredibly complicated and multi-layered. And it's an amazing place for artists, for scholars, for many people to focus on, and perhaps many of the clashes and conflicts that matter so much in the world today are taking place in Turkey. So in that regard, it's an interesting case study for scholars as well. It's my motherland, a country where I feel emotionally very much attached to, and it breaks my heart that it has been sliding backwards very fast. We are a very, very badly divided country. In the last decade, Turkey has changed a lot. And I think today what we are lacking is the culture of democracy, even though we have the ballot box, and certainly the ballot box is extremely important, and I respect that. Having the ballot box and free elections in itself does not make a system a democracy. That's only the first step. You need other things for a true democracy. You need separation of powers, rule of law. You need definitely women's rights, minority rights, definitely a free and diverse media. So without all these things, what you have is only a majoritarianism as long as you depend on the ballot box. So I think in Turkey what's happening is the politicians are confusing majoritarianism, the dominance of the majority, with democracy. They're not the same thing.
Do you feel that this divide is irreversible, or is there something that can be done? Where do we start from?
There is enormous damage in the sense that we have become a very angry nation, and it's one of the things that makes me very sad to observe is we can't even mourn together, grieve together. There have been terrible terror attacks in Turkey, for instance, and one would expect the nation to get united against this monster of terrorism. But even then, I have seen people being, still being divided. We are mostly divided into invisible ghettos. So that is quite worrisome, that we are divided into islands of people who do not break bread together, exchange words. In such an environment, it's much more difficult to cultivate coexistence, a culture of coexistence, and remind people of our shared values. For me, those shared values have to revolve around democratic values. So this is what we need to cultivate in Turkey, but it's becoming increasingly harder to do so.
Are you optimistic?
I think I am a Gramscian. I like Gramsci's approach in that regard. He always talks about the pessimism of the intellect, the pessimism of the mind, and the optimism of the will, optimism of the heart. So I think I'm half and half. When I look at politics, politicians in Turkey, and the way things work or do not work, to be honest, I feel very, very demoralized, increasingly so. But then when I meet people, it's amazing. We have such beautiful minds, young people, women, subcultures, minorities, and their vision, how they're, despite all the odds, how they are globally connected. Those things matter enormously. So when I look at the people, I feel more optimistic. And I believe in places like Turkey, we should always bear in mind that the people is ahead of their governments. Almost a year after the elections in Turkey, and now I'm observing the election campaigns in the States, and there are very interesting similarities in the sense that both have become very badly and deeply polarized, divided societies. And unfortunately, most of the time, politics depends on emotions rather than facts. Talking about truths, it has become a place where mostly male politicians express their emotions and sometimes galvanize the masses, again, via using those emotional tools. So I do see similarities in that regard, and I find it very unhealthy for a society when people become so badly divided and they forget the simple fact that despite their differences, despite the different parties they might be voting for, they also have something very big in common in terms of their culture, their upbringing, the values they share. So it's the culture of coexistence that's being eroded in both countries. But that said, at the same time, obviously there are enormous differences, and it makes a massive difference whether a country is a functioning democracy or not. So in America, obviously, in terms of rule of law, separation of powers, and the existence of a, relatively speaking, free and diverse media, the situation is much better in that regard. But all over the world, I think we are observing the rise of populism, the rise of populist politicians who appeal to the masses and to the fears and anxieties of the masses. And this is a very, very dangerous trend. There are several reasons as to how we got here, but the first, perhaps the most important one, is related to globalization and its undesired, unprecedented effects. Not that long ago, we must remember, there was so much optimism that we would, thanks to globalization, we would all become a big, major global village, that thanks to technology and the circulation of capital and ties of commerce and financial ties, we would not need any more national boundaries. The world become more and more international, multicultural, and religion would be passé, unnecessary. So there are so many articles, and that was the mood about 20 years ago. Where we are now is almost the exact opposite. What happened in the meantime, as globalization gained speed, it also created people who were not happy with what was going on. And the number of people who were not happy increased everywhere, all over the world. We have to see that because it has an enormous impact on politics. So today what we are seeing all over the world is a rise of nationalism, definitely a rise in religiosity, and a rise in what I call tribalism, the desire to go back to tribes, imaginary tribes, defined on the basis of either ethnicity or nationality, but the illusion, there's an increasing illusion that sameness will bring safety. And this is a very dangerous illusion, because sameness will not bring safety. So people tend to think that if I am surrounded by like-minded people, if I'm surrounded by people who are exactly like me, my life will be safer and my children's life will be safer. We have to understand that we are far too globalized, and all our lives, all our destinies, our stories are interconnected. So building walls, shutting doors on other people is not the solution. It won't help anything. Instead, what we need to promote is first and foremost democracy, because unfortunately the number of people who are saying, well, maybe democracy is not the only way, maybe it's not suitable for our culture, let's find other alternative models. And those alternative models could be very authoritarian models. So we have to renew people's faith in democracy and democratic values. The only way we can do this is together as world citizens, as global souls. I think we need to revive a radical humanism that shows people what they have in common and not focus only and only on the differences. What I'm worried about today is the rise of populism, the rise of tribalism, the rise of a new way of doing politics that is very much based on emotions and people's fear. We should never belittle fear or anxiety. I understand that I'm a person full of anxieties myself, but I also know that when anxiety and fear dominates politics or becomes the main guide, the outcome could be extremely dangerous. So today it is as if we haven't learned that much from history, and I'm not talking about, you know, centuries ago. I'm talking about recent history, when humanity was divided very dangerously into categories. Economy is definitely one of the major factors, and of course unemployment is one of the major factors. But we have to understand, in addition to these hardships that many people are facing, there is an underlying fear of the other, fear of differences, fear of, you know, people who are simply different, who dress up differently, who come from different backgrounds, to be more precise, who come from different religious backgrounds or cultural backgrounds. So that fear is also a very important factor, and this is something very difficult to measure. You know, you can't touch fear, you can't show it to other people. It's much more subtle, diffused, but I think it's definitely an important factor in the way politics are moving today, both in the national and also international sphere. We have seen how important was fear in the Brexit campaign, for instance, and in all the discussions and possible referendums across Europe. We are seeing it in the American elections. So definitely we need to understand what people are afraid of and why are they so anxious about the future. It is quite understandable, and I criticize sometimes the left for not trying to understand it better, and we cannot look down upon people's fears. This is a real, sincere feeling, but we have to connect and communicate. Yeah. So in a world where there's so much happening so fast, where there's terrorism or the fear that the next terror attack could happen anytime, in a world where you see lots of displacements, movements, people in very large numbers trying to shift locations because they have no other choice. In such a world, I think many people fear that the future is going to be very ambivalent, and where they make the mistake is to think that if they close the doors, if they live in smaller tribal communities, they'll be safer. That's where I think it's an illusion. But the fear itself is real, and we have to understand that. The life of a novelist in Turkey is very different than the life of a novelist in the UK or in many other Western countries, because in Turkey novelists are mostly regarded as public figures, and as a result I think we get a lot of love and a lot of hatred at the same time. It feels like being kissed and slapped at the same time, so it's a bit schizophrenic, the life of a writer, to be honest. But at the same time I think it's becoming increasingly more difficult, because in my motherland in Turkey words are heavy. And every writer, every journalist, every poet, academic knows that because of an essay you have written, because of an interview you give, even because of a tweet, you know, you might be sued, you might be lynched in social media in one night, you might be labeled as a traitor, you might even be put on trial, imprisoned, or exiled. So as a result, I think because this knowledge is at the back of our minds, there is a very subtle but widespread self-censorship. Some subjects are much more difficult to talk about. There are political taboos. In my opinion, there are also sexual taboos, which are equally difficult to talk about. And I believe, to be honest, I wouldn't believe any writer from Turkey who tells you I'm 100% free to write whatever I want. There's no such thing anymore. The most difficult profession in Turkey is definitely journalism. It's very difficult to be a public intellectual in Turkey. But I must also tell you, maybe I am making a distinction between fiction and non-fiction. When I'm writing non-fiction, yes, I do get anxious sometimes. I still speak my mind. But when I'm writing fiction, the anxiety disappears, because I live in an imaginary world and I'm not connected to this so-called real world. So I believe in my fiction, when I'm writing a novel, I feel much more free, light, courageous. And only when the novel is finished and I hand it to my editor, I start to get worried about, what people are going to say. But by then it's too late, It has a life of its own, a journey of its own, and I respect the novel's own personality and journey. So I think when we're writing fiction, we always feel much more free. Intellectually and maybe spiritually, I'm a nomad, and all my life, going back to my childhood, has been shaped by the commute between different cultures, different cities, different languages. I've learned a lot from that. I was born in France, in Strasbourg. I came back to Turkey with my mother. I was raised by a single mom. I spent part of my childhood in Madrid, came back to Turkey, and then there was a time in Jordan, Germany briefly, came back to Istanbul, and then Boston, Michigan, Arizona, Tucson, then Istanbul and London. So there have been many cities in my life, and I owe each a lot. I learned a lot from each. So I'm a nomad in that regard. But of course, I'm emotionally very attached to Istanbul. I'm an Istanbulite. I do like to think that we can have more than one home. We can have multiple homes. So in addition to being an Istanbulite, I'm also a Londoner. Definitely, I have elements in my soul from the Middle East. I am very attached to the Balkans, to the Mediterranean, but I'm a European by choice, by the values I adhere to, and I'm a world citizen. I'd like to think that I'm a global soul. So I don't choose one single identity for myself. I believe in multiple belongings. And at the end of the day, I think if you're a writer, you can only have one homeland, and that is Storyland. It's a portable homeland. You carry it with you wherever you go. Definitely, I find it difficult, more and more difficult to, write books in Turkey. But at the same time, I do know that books matter in Turkey. People, those who read books, do so passionately, and there's a very emotional connection with the readers that I cherish. Exile is an interesting word. I mean, yes, I think. Mine is some kind of self-imposed exile, but I have always been in this state of mind. I've always felt like the other in my own motherland. I've always felt like an insider-outsider, enough of an insider to understand, enough of an outsider to observe. It's a very lonely threshold, position, but maybe that's the best position for an artist. I think all over the world, definitely in some countries more than others, but all over the world, politics is so much shaped by men, and it's quite masculinist. In some places where the culture of democracy is very low, it's also quite aggressive and divisive. In Turkey, we have seen over and over conservative male politicians telling us Turkish women, telling us from above how we should be living our lives, how we should make, how many children we should make, 3, preferably 5, telling us that abortion is mass murder, and how we should not laugh loudly in the public space because modest Turkish women do not do that, and such ridiculous statements. And they have, of course, no right. It's our lives, it is our bodies, and I find it very wrong, unacceptable that male politicians try to shape women's lives from above. I've never heard a female politician or any female coming forward and saying, by the way, this is how men should be living their lives, this is how they should dress up, and this is how many kids they should, be having, etc. So we do not talk about their lives, but the opposite is happening very often. But also all around the world, I think we see more and more angry, particularly white male politicians, speaking very loudly, making general statements, sweeping generalizations, losing nuances, not caring about nuances, and becoming very, very popular, appealing to the feelings of the masses. And this is a very, very dangerous trend. And we have to see that because we are so globalized now, everything is interconnected. What's happening in one country affects what's happening in another country. the madness going in one country has repercussions beyond the borders of that country. So we're all in this together as world citizens. That is why I believe we need to promote cosmopolitanism in this life. If we learn anything, we learn it from people who are different from us. We need to promote the beauty of diversity. Yes, diversity is a challenge, but it's a treasure. And I come from a country that has lost a lot by losing its cosmopolitan heritage. And I wouldn't want other countries to make the same mistake. I think extremism is one of the biggest challenges we will be having as humanity in the next decades. And we see a rise in extremist ideologies, and extremism in one place, in one part of the world, breeds extremism elsewhere. For instance, Islamophobia, let's say, in one part of the world creates, Islamophobia in Europe, let's say, creates or fuels more anti-Western sentiments in the Middle East, and vice versa. Anti-Western sentiments in one part of the world creates more Islamophobia elsewhere. So we need to break this vicious circle. We need to get out of this vicious circle. Otherwise, there will be more and more extremism everywhere. And there's one thing all extremists have in common. You know, the far right, Islamic fundamentalists, they might seem very different, but they have one thing in common. They hate complexity. They like simplicity. And they do want to reduce us as human beings. They do want to reduce us as to a single identity. They want to narrow us down to a single label. Are you Muslim? Then be a Muslim. But their definition of Muslimness. Or the far right says, are you a German? Be a German. Be only this or that. But that is against human nature. As human beings, we have lots of selves inside us. We are made of water. We have multiple belongings, multiple voices. So we have to understand that you can be Muslim by birth. At the same time, you can be secular. At the same time, a Danish citizen, a European, you know, at the same time, a global soul. You can be many things at the same time. Many, a long list. We have to remember the complexity, the beauty of complexity. I think one of the things that fiction does is to talk about nuances, is to talk about complexities. And we must bear in mind that for extremism, unfortunately, for extremism to work, they need to dehumanize the other. They need to show that the other is not a human. You can commit the most awful atrocities against a fellow human being only and only when you forget that person is also a human being. So that process of dehumanization lies at the core of all extremist ideologies. Now, what does fiction do? Fiction rehumanizes. Fiction tells us that, wait a minute, it's not it's not about statistics, it's not about numbers. You know, the person you saw as the other has a story. And once you know somebody's story, it's impossible for you to dehumanize that person, because if you know somebody's story, then you can connect with that person's sorrow or that person's hopes, where that person was hurt. At least you can understand, you can empathize. The moment we can empathize with someone else, we cannot dehumanize that person. So fiction and extremism, they work in completely opposite ways. And I think in a world of so much conflict, so much extremism, we need art, we need fiction, we need the art of storytelling more than ever before.
So art has to come and save the world in a way?
I'm not saying art is going to save the world, of course, but I believe stories do make a difference, and I think it is a responsibility, a growing responsibility on the parts of authors to speak up more. You know, we can't, of course, it's a big challenge for us, because as writers we are introverted creatures and we like to live in our imaginary cocoons. But when so much is happening in the world, there's so much pain, I think more and more of us need to come into the public space and speak up more loudly in favor of cosmopolitanism, in favor of empathy, in favor of diversity, and in favor of our common human values. I also believe, as a feminist, that we need to hear more and more women in the public space, especially across the Middle East. I think we don't have enough women in the public space speaking loudly. We have amazing women who are very strong characters, but more and more, as you travel across the Middle East, you will see squares, streets belong to men, public squares belong to men, cities belong to men. And women are being pushed into the private space very, very systematically. So it's very important to bring women back into the public space, but also have a diversity of opinions and a free debate, open debate in the public space. Turkey has been a very divided country for a very long time. It is a very fragmented society. At the first glance, of course, the biggest rift is an ideological division between the supporters of the AKP and the opponents of the AKP. So that is the biggest division. It's also sometimes a cultural division, not only an ideological one. In addition to political divide, there are also ethnic divisions, religious divisions. So, for instance, we have Alevis, the Alevi minority, and they're not being treated equally. They have not been treated equally for a very long time. Then we have, of course, the clash between the Kurdish identity and Turkish nationalism, and this is a major question. The Kurds still not having, the rights to education in their mother tongue, and there are lots of cultural rights that they have been voicing, they have been demanding for a very long time and have still not been able to achieve. Unfortunately, there's also a pro-violence tendency among some of the Kurdish groups. And then, of course, there's the aggressiveness of Turkish nationalism. And these keep breeding each other and making things more complicated. In addition to that, we have 3 million refugees from Syria. I think it's commendable that Turkey accepted. I find it very positive that Turkey welcomed so many refugees, but at the same time I am critical of the fact that there isn't proper planning with regards to how they will live, how their children will be educated, and the job opportunities, how they will be integrated. So there are massive problems. And of course we have problems with regards to security. We have seen horrific terrorist attacks, a series of terrorist attacks that have shaken and shattered the society. So in that regard, Turkey is trying to exist in a very difficult region. Sometimes I have to remind myself and others that our neighbors are not Denmark, Norway, Sweden, developed democracies. Our neighbors in Turkey are Syria, Iran, Iraq, Russia. It's a very difficult geographical location as well. And it's not helping that Turkey is not improving its democracy, but it's walking in the complete opposite direction. That doesn't help either. My earliest novels were all written in Turkish first. And then after a certain point, I started writing in English first. It started in Boston when I was at Mount Holyoke, about 13, almost 14 years ago now. And ever since then, every novel I have written in English first. And when it's over, I give it to my translator. And the translator, a professional translator, translates it into Turkish. And then I take the Turkish translation and I rewrite it with my own vocabulary and rhythm. So it's a bit insane because you have to almost work twice as hard. But I do it because first and foremost I love languages. I love the alphabet like a child loves, the alphabet. But at the same time, I think I find an additional sense of freedom. When you speak another language, when you try to think in another language, it is a challenge, and I think as foreigners we're always aware that our minds work faster than our tongues. There's a gap between the tongue and the brain, and and you always want to say more, you end up saying less. It can be frustrating, but I think that frustration is good because it helps you to think more carefully about nuances, what you can say and what you weren't able to say, and why is that. It also helps you to compare languages, to compare cultures. And so this commute back and forth between the English language and the Turkish language helped me to perhaps feel closer to each language in a different way. My connection with the Turkish language is more maybe emotional. It's the language of my childhood, my grandmother. My connection with the English language is more intellectual, more cerebral, and I need both. I realized over time, if I'm writing about humor, satire, irony, I prefer to do that in English. I find it much easier in the English language. But if there's melancholy, loss, sorrow, I find it easier to do so in Turkish. And that is more than a linguistic difference. I think it's a cultural difference. I was criticized very bitterly in Turkey when I started writing in English years ago. They still criticize. They say a Turkish writer, should only write in the Turkish language, and they accuse me of abandoning my mother tongue, and they say I should not be called a Turkish writer anymore. And I find all these discussions very limited and very limiting. I think they belong to 19th century definitions of nationalism and nation state. They're not relevant anymore in the 21st century, because this is the century of displacements, migrations, movements. This is the century of people who do and who can dream in more than one language. When we go to sleep at night, our brain is perfectly capable of starting one dream in one language and ending it in another language, because the brain recognizes no such national boundaries. And so that is always encouraging for me. If I can dream in more than one language, maybe I can write stories in more than one language as well. My new novel, Three Daughters of Eve, is coming out in February 2017, published by Penguin. And this is the story of a woman called Peri, her quest for faith, identity, belonging, God, and love. And in a way, her failure to find these things. It's a book that asks lots of difficult questions about religion, about spirituality, about belongings, about gender. It's a book that has a lot of humor in it as well. In this novel there are three girls. One of them is Shirin. She is Iranian British, and she's very critical of Islam, and she's very critical of all religions, but in particular of Islam. And then there's Mona, who is Egyptian American, and she wears a headscarf, and she wants to live her religion in peace, and she doesn't understand why people are critical of her. And then there's the Turkish woman, Peri, who is a bit confused, because I think confusion is what we Turks do best. So I call these three women, Shirin, Mona, and Peri, the sinner, the believer, and the confused. And as I tell their stories, I question faith, I question religiosity, I talk about Islam, feminism, and the clashes that we have today, but always through the eyes of women. I'm not a religious person. Actually, I find organized religions very unhealthy, because they divide humanity between categories of us versus them, and they always held the assumption that us is better than them. That is not close to my heart. So I'm not a religious person at all. But I'm interested in God. I'm interested in spirituality. I'm interested in mysticism. And that to me is something completely different. It's a very individual journey that recognizes no limits. You might be interested in Islamic mysticism, you will find yourself reading more on Jewish mysticism. And as you're reading on Jewish mysticism, you will end up reading more on Christian mysticism, because there are no boundaries. And the mystics of the past, I believe if we could bring them around the dinner table, they would be breaking bread together, they would be sharing water together, they would have so much to say to each other. So someone like, for instance, Isaac Luria from Jewish mysticism, right? Or Teresa de Avila, Meister Eckhart from Christian mysticism, or Ibn Arabi or Rumi from Islamic mysticism, they were saying more or less exactly the same things. That commonality is something we have forgotten today, because it was a quest, and they were interested in how we were all interconnected, and there was more modesty, So I'm interested in spirituality in a very non-religious way. But I think what I am much more interested in is this juxtaposition of faith and doubt. Because I think in life one needs faith. And faith not necessarily actually in a religious sense, because when you start writing a novel and you don't know what's going to happen, where you're going to end up, it's an act of faith. You know, you have faith in the story you're going to tell. You have faith that someone will read it and it will matter to them. When you move to a new city or to a new country, you know, that's an act of faith. When you fall in love and you don't know who this stranger is, why did you fall in love with this person? That also is faith. So in life we do need specks of faith. But I also believe firmly that we need doubt. We have to doubt our truths, otherwise we will end up with dogmas. We should always be questioning, and questions are much more precious than answers. I'm afraid of people who think they have found the answers, because that comes with a lot of arrogance, and they close the doors, their mental doors, their intellectual doors. But people who like to be on the road, on the move, always asking questions, they're much more modest, and those questions matter. So doubt is precious. And what is much more precious is this very difficult, but in my opinion, very beautiful dance between faith and doubt. So this is what my new book is about, and these are the questions that I maybe care about. Yeah, I do care about.